Welcome back to Self-Invested, where we talk about how you can do better with money. In this video, I talk with Sue Phillips, a semi-retired accountant, about her shared ownership experience. And specifically, we talk about the long-term costs of shared ownership. Now, I came across Sue because of her work on Twitter, raising awareness about the shared ownership scheme under the Twitter handle Shared Ownership Resources. She's also recently launched a website called sharedownershipresources.org to help prospective shared owners understand the scheme better. Now, if you want to have a look at her Twitter page or her website, I provided links to them down in the description to this video. Anyway, that's enough from me, and I hope you enjoy our chat. So yeah, why did you get into shared ownership?
I'd been renting with friends and I'd really enjoyed that, but I had got to the point where I wanted a place of my own. I was looking at flats and I actually started the process of buying a different flat. And it turned out that I was the estate agent's plan B, and they were ready. Even though I'd done a value and I'd started spending money, it turned out that they didn't really have an intention of selling it to me unless the first buyer fell through. And then I heard about this shared ownership flat. Number one, it was absolutely lovely. It was it was a converted industrial unit. It had brick walls. It had floor to ceiling windows. It was really lovely. So that was the most important thing. But also, because it was being sold by a housing association, I wasn't so worried about 50% because when I bought it in 1999, flats were much cheaper. So the issue of buying something on the open market, it wouldn't have been as impossible. But what I couldn't afford was to be gazumped and to pay legal fees over and over again. And I did know people that had happened to. I thought if I buy a flat from a housing association, it's not going to fall through. They're not going to sell it to anybody else. And really that, combined with the fact it was a lovely flat, is what sold it to me.
And did that happen with the first property? Did you already pay for legal fees and end up losing that because you weren't the estate agent's first choice?
No, but I was on the point of arranging factors and what.
Okay. And I'm guessing that first property as well. You're looking to buy that outright, or that would have been an outright property. And yes. So you almost thought with the housing association, working with them, you were in a safer pair of hands, essentially.
That was my thinking.
Yeah. And how much did it cost?
Bearing in mind this was 1999.
I know, it's going to sound like an absolute bargain.
It's going to sound like an absolute bargain. My first 50% was £30,000.
Okay. And what was the length of the lease? And did you have to pay ground rent?
Okay, there was no ground rent at that time. And I think ground rent is something that housing associations have started charging much more frequently since then, but I have no ground rent. The lease was 99 years, and at the time, I didn't know the significance of that at all.
You purchased 50% of your property in 1999 for £30,000, but then you later decided to staircase, or you were able to staircase to 100%. So when did you staircase, and how much did it cost you to buy the remaining share of your property?
I didn't staircase until 2013 because for various reasons to do with work. I couldn't afford it. I could have afforded it earlier on, but I didn't realise how important it was. And by the time I realised how important it was, I couldn't afford it anymore. So I met my husband in 2013, and at that point, we talked about whether to sell it or what to do with the flat. And I decided to get a buy-to-let mortgage to staircase to 100%. And at that point, friends of mine were looking for a flat, so I let it to my friends.
And how much did that share cost you, that remaining share?
That cost me 80,000.
80,000. So the value of your property went up from 60,000 up to 160,000.
That's right.
Yeah, right. So that doesn't sound like much, but I've just done some quick calculations, and let's say you bought that property today and it cost 300,000. That would be the equivalent of the initial share you would have bought of that property would have cost 150,000, but that the remaining 50,000, the remaining 50% share that you would buy 14 years later would cost 400,000. So that remaining share is cost more than the property did outright initially. So that is a big jump, and I don't think people realize um, that house prices increase so quickly, and they actually, I guess, they increase quicker than maybe salaries do over the same period of time, which makes it less affordable, doesn't it?
Yeah, statistically, very few people staircase to 100%. And I think in my own case, I was lucky that I met my husband and he already had a house that was mortgage free.
Hmm.
So I was in a position where moving with him allowed me to staircase with a buy to let mortgage. But I think if people buy a home and they don't move out of it, what generally happens, or what seems to happen, is that house prices go up so much faster than wages that a lot of people go into it thinking they're going to staircase and then finding, for exactly those reasons you've just described,
Hmm.
that actually it becomes unaffordable very, very quickly.
Yeah. Do you know how many shared owners are actually able to or actually do staircase to 100%?
Well, there's a little bit of a lack of public statistics on this,
Hmm.
but a a researcher produced a paper, a parliamentary briefing, um, a year or so ago, and the estimate in that paper was that 2.3% of shared owners staircased in 2018 to 2019. And I guess the more recent figures aren't available yet, but if that's indicative of the
Yeah.
average use, it's a very small percentage.
Yeah, and I think it's for those reasons. It's because, I mean, the way that people are going to be able to staircase up to 100% is probably by taking out a bigger mortgage. And when they bought their initial share, they probably maximized the share that they can afford. So for them to then staircase to 100% in the position like that you were in, potentially you would need your salary to double to be able to afford a mortgage twice that size to be able to. So it's no surprise that so few people are able to staircase up to 100%. But I guess that wasn't the only challenge you had with your shared ownership property, was it? I guess you bought your property in 2000, well, in 1999, and by the time you bought 100% of the property, it was 14 years later. I'm guessing your lease is ticking down at this time, but that you didn't realize there were any implications with that, did you?
No, I had no idea. 99 years sounded like a long time. I
Yeah.
just didn't realize there was any problem with that. And in 2018, I had a visit from my mortgage bank's valuer. And again, this was to do with my trying to manage my money sensibly because I would take out short fixed term mortgages, pay off a lump sum when one fixed term came to an end before the next one started,
Mhm.
and then continue with the next sort of the next short term mortgage
Mortgage,
arrangement.
yeah.
So the bank's valuer came round at the end of one of these sort of 2 year fixed term arrangements and mentioned that my flat was starting to go down in value because there were less than 80 years left, which was a real surprise to me. I had no idea that there was any kind of significance to 80 years on the mortgage, but it turns out that um, well, it's a really significant threshold for anybody going into any kind of leasehold flat to be aware of.
Mhm.
Um, so he informed me that if I wanted to maintain the value of my flat, not to increase it, to
Mhm.
maintain it, I would need to extend my lease. So I looked into this. I did a calculation using an online
Mhm.
calculator, and um, it came out that it could be around 30,000, including legal fees, and
Mhm.
that was 30,000 that I just did not have.
Mhm. Mhm. And so I'm guessing you approached your housing association to find out how much it would actually cost, and
Mm.
what did they say? How much did they initially come back to you with?
Well, initially, because to get an actual valuation rather
Mhm.
than a ballpark, valuation from an online calculator. To get an actual valuation, you have to trigger a legal process.
Mhm.
So you have a valuer on board and a solicitor, and you have to commence a formal process. And that's and there's a fixed time limit
Mhm.
to do that. So I thought there's no point starting the process because I know I haven't got £30,000. So there's no point starting the process that I'm not going to be able to finish.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I went back to my housing association, but with a question. I said, why didn't you tell me about this? And, it's affordable housing. It was sold with a 99-year lease. And even before I finished paying off my first mortgage, I have to find this additional sum of money to extend the lease. And their response was, your solicitor should have told you. So I went back to my first solicitor and said, why didn't you tell me? And their response was that because I was at that point, when I bought 50%, I didn't actually have a statutory right to lease extension. So therefore, there was no reason for them to tell me. So I went to the second solicitor and asked them why they hadn't informed me about the 80-year threshold. And their response was that all they were doing was they were facilitating the staircasing transaction. It wasn't the purchase as such, it was a staircasing transaction, and therefore the lease length was not part of what they were involved with in terms of
It
what they've
was
been taking.
outside their scope of
It was,
service. Yeah.
it was outside of their duty of care.
Mhm.
So my next step, I went to the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and basically I'm really puzzled. My housing association said my solicitor's responsible. My solicitors say they're not.
Everyone's
What's
passing the buck.
everyone's passing the buck? Where do I stand?
Mm.
And the Solicitors Regulation Authority said that there had been no professional misconduct on the part of my solicitors. So that kind of left me with nowhere to go, really. Then went back to my. Sorry, go on. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just on that, I do think, and the thing is, I would have said in that situation, speak to your solicitor, make sure you ask them the questions. And I'm surprised to hear that it's not considered within their duty of care to inform you, because the thing is, even though you're only buying 50% of that property, you're still buying a share of a lease, and a lease, which is a depreciating asset, which when it falls below 80 years is going to have implications for the buyer. So even if you only own 50%, it still has implications for you as a buyer. So I'm surprised they didn't see it within, or even the regulator didn't see it within their duty of care, because it still has implications for you as a shared owner, whether or not you this whatever, regardless of the percentage that you own.
There's two aspects to that. One, I have some sympathy with the solicitor's point of view, because I think that solicitors, they can't speculate about what might happen in the future. So I had bought a 50% share. I wasn't entitled to extend my lease under the statutory route. And even once I'd staircased, I would have to wait 2 years to be able to extend under the statutory route. I think that solicitors feel, and correctly so, that if they start offering advice based on what might happen in the future and what the legal context might be in the future, that's potentially a recipe for a disaster, really. They could inappropriate
No, I
advice
can
and
see that.
then be held accountable for that. So, having said that, I think that there has been a recognition within the legal sector as a whole that short leases are a problem, and I think that there is an increased recognition that it's important to
Highlight
information if the 80-year threshold is coming up fast, or if it's already been reached. If someone's buying a home that isn't a new build and the lease isn't issued. But I think if you're talking about those sums of money, people need to know this before they buy, because it's that you have to plan for. And also, the earlier you do it, the cheaper it is. So if you don't find out 15 years down the line, it's probably become affordable where it would have been at the beginning. So my personal point of view is that associations have a responsibility
Mhm.
to make this information available to people
Mhm.
so that they can make informed decisions about whether or not to buy that shared ownership property, and
Mhm.
then to plan for the long term and
Mhm.
to take those future costs into account when they're thinking about how much they can afford to pay. Because you're not then just thinking about, well, I can pay the mortgage and I can pay the rent and I can pay the
Mhm.
service charge. You also might want to be thinking, can I afford to put a bit aside each month to
Mhm.
pay for the lease extension as soon as possible? So
Yeah,
people
I
are
agree with that.
making decisions without all the facts that
Mhm.
they need. So I'm very strongly of the opinion that housing associations have a moral responsibility to
Mhm.
give first time buyers all the facts that they need.
Especially as a social landlord. They're not any type of landlord. They have a special or unique position. They are supposed to be providing affordable housing and housing solutions to people that can't afford properties in the private sector, whether that's renting or whether they're buying outright. So I agree with you. The fact that they're there for people that aren't, as well off as others, and um, you know, I guess in the BBC Panorama documentary, they said people that are more financially vulnerable. I guess there is, more care that should be shown in the information that they give to share them. So yeah, I definitely take that point.
And I think when we talk about affordability, I think a big part of the problem is that it really depends what timescale you're talking about.
Hmm.
So the promise of affordability and being cheaper than buying on the open market or being
Hmm.
cheaper than renting. I think the justification for housing associations saying it's cheaper than buying on the open market is that you need a smaller deposit.
Hmm.
So that makes it more affordable. And then the justification in relation to renting is that it's cheaper than renting on the open market. But these things only hold true over the short term. And once you start looking at what are the total costs over 25, 30, 40 years, it's a very different picture.
Hmm. So can you tell me then? So how much did it cost to extend your lease?
It cost me a lot less than I thought to extend my lease. Now, that was for two reasons, really. One was part of the reason it was so expensive was the housing association had started um, taking advantage of a recent legal precedent, the Zucconi precedent, which meant that my lease extension would have been roughly twice as much as neighbours had paid a couple of years beforehand. And of course, the reason they did it a couple of years beforehand was that they'd actually had access to funds and I didn't at that
Hmm.
point.
Hmm.
So I went back to my housing association and said, I think it's unjustifiable that you didn't tell me that I had a short lease and you didn't tell me about the 80-year threshold. But I think it's particularly unfair that you are now charging me twice what you charge neighbours because this legal precedent means that you can.
Hmm.
Not because you have to, but because you can. And I was lucky that my housing association actually agreed with me that I should have parity with my neighbours in the block. So, whereas their valuer initially calculated a premium of about 23,000, which was taking the security into account, and
Hmm.
that's not including legal fees. The
Hmm.
legal valuation fees in the end came to about 4,000. So in total, it would have been 27,000, not far off the
What
original.
you initially thought? Yeah.
Um, but actually, they then instructed their valuer to calculate it without taking advantage of this new precedent, and that figure came to 12,000. So it still cost me 16,000 with the legal fees, which is still a huge amount of money, and it's an amount of money that most people simply won't have access to.
Do you think it's fair to say that, I guess, if you hadn't met your partner and moved in with your now husband, that you wouldn't, one, have been able to staircase to 100%, and again, you wouldn't have been able um to extend your lease, and it's, mainly, I don't know, possibly purely because of that fact that you were actually able to do those two things.
Yeah, moving in with my partner allowed me to get a bite. It was a one bedroom flat. I couldn't have
Mhm.
let it out without
Yeah.
actually living somewhere else myself. And actually, it's worth saying that if someone has a part share in their flat, there are a lot of restrictions on letting it. So
Mhm.
unless the staircase to 100%, moving out and letting it to somebody else is probably not going to be an option. There have to be exceptional circumstances to allow
Mhm.
you to let. Because I staircase to 100%, that then gave me the entitlement, with the agreement of my housing
Mhm.
association, be able to get a buy-to-let mortgage, but the staircase into 100% was essential for that. So that worked really well. I moved out, I staircased to 100%, I had a buy-to-let mortgage. The finding the money for the lease extension was very difficult because my
Mhm.
husband is retired. We're comfortable, but we
Mhm.
certainly didn't have the kind of income coming in between us
Yeah.
that would have us to find 16,000.
Mhm.
It was actually a very distressing time because I had been planning to work part time to spend more time with my husband.
Mhm.
And when I was thinking about how to find the 16,000, I basically would have had to have carried on working until my husband was in his 80s. I mean, it was an option, and he didn't have savings. So I spent a couple of years really agonising over this, thinking I don't want my flat to be a depreciating asset. You know, I spent all this. I've put a lot of effort into paying the mortgage, into paying the mortgage off faster, so that I have an asset. I don't want it to be going down in value from here on. But I also didn't want to work until my husband was in his 80s, obviously.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, so for a couple of years, I really agonised. What do I do? What do I do? And in the end, the way that we resolved it, and I'm going to say this knowing how lucky I am, but also it was fairly life changing for both of us. My husband sold his house in London, and we raised the money by moving out of London to a cheaper house.
Mhm.
So it was. I was very very lucky, but also it was quite an upsetting thing for me because when I bought my flat as a single woman, I thought this is something I've achieved. I bought my own flat.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in the end, I didn't buy it myself at all. I was utterly dependent on my husband, on the moving in with him, and then on him selling his house
Mhm.
to
To
give
move
me the
back.
money out of
Yeah.
my lease expenses. So in the end, I hadn't bought my own flat at all. I was just very lucky that I had the support of someone who helped me.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people are not going to be in that position. They're going to have bought their flats as a couple, perhaps,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
they're just not going to have those options. A lot of people are going
No.
to find themselves trapped in a flat where they can't afford a staircase, they can't afford to extend the lease, and then that potentially has financial complications that maybe they didn't expect when they bought the flat in the first place.
So yeah, based on your experience or because of your experience, you're doing something quite remarkable. Or you started doing something. You sort of alluded to it earlier that you started sort of campaigning um, for shared owners. So yeah, so tell me what you've decided to do, or what you've done because of your experience with shared ownership.
Well, initially, I started trying to talk to journalists because I thought this issue needed more, people needed to be more aware of the issue of leasehold extension. So I started off really trying to get more public awareness, and that was very difficult. I think people, um, shared ownership was a bit niche at the time. People weren't that, it wasn't newsworthy
Hmm.
really, even though and I think also because a lot of people weren't in this position yet. I could see a lot of people were going to end up in this situation, but I think until a lot of people are affected by a situation, it isn't newsworthy. So what I've done, well, long story short, I've set up a website because I just feel that if nobody else is being completely transparent about these long-term costs, then I'm going to do it myself. So I've set up a website which aims to give people a sort of less simplistic view of shared ownership. But I'm not saying it can't work for anybody; it can work for people, but I think they need to have a really good understanding of what the long-term costs are and the kind of things that they need to be thinking about. Some of the language that's used in relation to shared ownership is not very precise. So, for example,
Hmm.
we talk about getting on the housing ladder. What does that mean? Does that
Hmm.
mean buying something and selling it on to make a gain, or does it mean buying your forever home in instalments? Because those two groups of people have conflicting requirements, really.
Hmm.
If you
Hmm.
want to buy something and then treat it as a starter home and make a gain, and buy something bigger, you want the property market to be going up. But if you're intending to staircase, you don't want the market to be going up. So these are things that I think when the term foot on the housing ladder is used, people who are buying a home need to think about what that means for them. And this may not be something that that's very obvious at the point when you're looking at a flat and going, I love it, it's beautiful, I want to live there. So I'm really looking to encourage first time buyers to think through these issues a bit more and to give them the information to be able to think through them a bit more as well.
Can you just let us know what your website is called?
Yeah, it's shared ownership resources. So the address is www.sharedownershipresources.org.
Can you just talk about sort of the information that you'll be sharing or providing on the website as well?
If people go to the website, at the moment it just launched today, so what they'll find if they go there over the next couple of weeks is there's a frequently asked questions section, which, to be honest, is probably not so much frequently asked questions as the questions that people would ask if they knew they needed to. But it's kind of a quick tour of shared ownership, the things that people need to know. So it covers aspects, not only the financial aspects, but also the nature of shared ownership. People may not realise that it's not shared, that actually as a shared owner, you are responsible for 100% of most of the costs when it comes to service charges, for example. It's also not ownership. People may not be aware that the legal status of a shared ownership leasehold is actually assured tenant, and that has implications as well. So I try and explain these issues. So that's the frequently asked questions section. There's a my shared ownership home section. Something I've noticed is when you find case studies, obviously they're all success stories because they often appear on marketing sites. So I thought it was important to reflect the good, the bad, and the ugly. So there are it's going to be a series of case studies talking about their own very different experiences of shared ownership. There's a need to know section where I'm going to pick up topics and just explore them one by one. So that will, as time goes on, that will expand greatly in the number of topics that are being covered there. I'm also lucky enough to have a number of sponsors, and the sponsors will be writing features from their expert point of view on subjects like, for example, lease extension we've been talking about. I'm hoping to get some specialist information on mortgages and other subjects that may be relevant. Everyone's going into their shared ownership home with, I guess, a different plan, a different intention. So not everything's going to be relevant to everybody, but hopefully everyone who comes to the site will find something that is relevant to their situation.